Hi all. So this is going to be our last video for the semester. Um, we've shared a lot of ideas so far. I've even gotten some video links from you all, sharing some of the videos that you found, and then I've been adding those to our shared YouTube channel for the semester, so go and check those out. I will be adding some new videos this week in terms of technique, shared by other artists that are going to be really helpful for you all, more towards the finishing side of things and less towards the sort of making with clay, sort of as we get near the end of the semester. So I thought what I wanted to do today, rather than showing you all how to make something, I wanted to share some resources that I use when I'm thinking about demonstrations I can do for you, or even if I just sort of want to go back and refresh myself and get a better in-depth understanding. For me, a lot of what I know has been self-taught. It's been picked up through workshops and residencies, working with other artists. So it's always good for me to go back and sort of review technique, processes, why does clay react that way. For the Foundations in Raku class, it's a shorter class. It's a 2-credit, not a 3-credit course. So just we have less time together, which is something we knew going into this. But I think one thing that's really important that we don't really get to dive into as much because of the structure of that class is just understanding our materials. So I want to touch on a couple of things. I want to touch on clay bodies. I want to touch on underglazes and slips. And then again, I just kind of want to talk about finishing and just sort of briefly go over how to consider those things. What considerations when you're choosing certain glazes or certain clay bodies, what am I thinking? Why am I choosing these things? I'm also going to show you some books that I look at. Okay. So to start, this book, it's pretty new. It's being integrated into different departments. We don't have a hand building class per se. At Laney, we combine pottery and hand building techniques into what we call ceramics. So beginning ceramics, intermediate ceramics, so on and so forth. But what I do see is that certain people navigate towards hand building pottery or sculpture, and some folks navigate to the wheel. And that's just sort of the way it goes with any really craft-based practice. You're going to have people that love making jewelry, and then you're going to have people that love casting, right? So there's different facets of all these different sort of craft-based practices where we can sort of focus our interests. Totally cool, totally normal, highly encouraged, okay? As a Jane of all trades, sometimes it's good to kind of focus. I tend to have too many tools in my toolbox sometimes and get a little crazy with options, too many options. Anyways, this book, it's backwards to you all, but Hand Built. It's a book by Melissa Weiss. And it's basically going to go through different hand building techniques. So from carved cups to making platters, different texture options, different finishing options like slips and glazes, different tools you can use, making your own tools. And the best part about this book is it doesn't just tell you, right? It shows you. So then there's step-by-step guides in terms of how to go about these practices and making these different forms. So if you all are looking to continue your home practice or just looking for additional resources to aid you as you continue to take courses or practice on your own elsewhere, this is a great book, okay? The book we had assigned for our class, which I don't know if everyone got, The Hands in Clay by John Toki and Charlotte Spate, okay? This is just a great book. It's going to go over glazes. It's more informational, so it'll talk about kiln structures, firing structures. It starts to differentiate between raku, high fire, low fire. This is what I would consider more like a technical guide. So there's introductory processes in terms of technique, and then there's more advanced information in here. Whereas, for instance, the hand building book, it's going to literally walk you through almost like an in-class demonstration. I would go further to say that the Hands in Clay book is going to be a great additional resource. So as you start to delve further into your understanding of clay, why are we choosing the clay we're choosing? Why did I get this certain effect, for instance, from the clay, and glaze that I chose to use? That's going to have a lot of information in there. So maybe there's a higher iron content. Maybe there's a higher level of glass former, for instance. And so they're interacting. Why is my glaze cracking off of the surface? So it's going to talk about interfaces and what that means. Okay? Basically a really, really, really good technical guide. This is the book we had for our class, so hopefully you guys have checked it out. Then just some additional resources. Clay and Glaze for the Potter. This one's by Daniel Rhodes. This is a 3rd edition. I think there's more recent editions as well. This is, again, just a great resource guide, different glaze options, results of those, what clays you can choose, as well as some recipes and visual examples. So Ceramics and Print. This is a pretty cool book. It's by Paul Scott, and it sort of goes through different surface techniques using decals, for instance, screen printing, using speedball, inks, for instance, mason stains, transfers. It talks about a lot of different like textures you can get, how you can use texture on clay to essentially transfer to a paper surface, and sort of what's the relationship between print and clay. I showed some examples early on in class where you saw some artists working with those things in conjunction. There's a lot of examples out there. Israel Davis, for instance, is a great example where they're using hand building techniques, but then they're screen printing images. So you can incorporate the idea of screen printing colored slips, for instance, onto some leather hard clay. And then once that's bisqued, consider doing low fire decal transfers. Okay, so how can you sort of really start to treat the ceramic surface more like a canvas rather than something we think of as maybe this atmospheric, functional design object? It's more becoming this artistic communication device, right? You can take that a step further and think, well, how are these images relating to the form, the historical function of that form, the culture related to the historical form itself, and then what is that imagery doing in relation to all of those things? So you can get really conceptual as well. Great example of that is Ai Weiwei, for instance, with some of his work using historical Chinese vessels from like Jinjidin era. I forget which dynasty he was specifically working with for some of his pieces, but throwing and breaking historical vessels, that were thousands of years old as a performance. Or taking some of those historical vessels and then painting Coca-Cola on those vessels, for instance. So really playing with how that decoration speaks to the form, what that conversation between those elements mean to the person that's viewing them. So those are just some resources for you all to think about as you go on your merry way after this class, okay? So I wanted to talk about slips, glazes, and underglazes. It's something we did a little bit of. I demoed slip application, actually, I think the last day we were in class together, but it was just slip application for vessels. So decoration, there's lots of different ways you can do this. So there's different processes. You can just apply the slip to actually get a different color clay body. So for instance, I could be working with like an earthenware dark clay body, but then I could apply, for instance, a porcelain slip to that clay body, which then will allow whatever glaze I apply to that to have a much different effect had I just applied that glaze, for instance, to the darker clay body. But the interaction of that porcelain slip and that dark clay body in relation to the glaze is going to have this overall look that you wouldn't just get, be it just porcelain or just like an earthenware, for instance, or a terracotta body. Little spider. There you go, buddy. So slips you can apply completely to cover your clay. You can use them as patterning, so different brushes give you different effects. Is it a dry brush? Is it a long brush? Is it a soft brush? Is it horsehair? Is it grass? So how are you applying that slip? What pattern and texture are you looking for? And this is something you can play with infinitely, okay? So just using brush techniques, all right? It can be minimal, single stroke, right? Or you can cover the entire vessel, for instance, or platter or sculpture with texture. Now, when it comes to slips and underglazes, they can be different consistencies. So typically, an underglaze and a slip can be somewhat considered synonymous materials, though they are slightly different. When you purchase underglazes from a company, for instance, they've been super specifically formulated to function and be compatible sort of across the board with different glazes, different clay bodies. So those are pretty much set. If you start making your own slips at home, for instance, you can play with different consistencies. So if my slip is thicker, I can actually start building that surface up. I can start creating texture on the surface of my clay. In glass, we call something like that a prunt, which a prunt historically was sort of texture on the outside of a cup. So before we had forks and knives, we would just sort of eat our meat and we would, eat our food or whatever. And so the prunts would actually create texture on the glass so it didn't slip out of our hands when they're just messy and dirty with food. So that's the historical function of that. But with clay, you can do that same idea with like a thicker slip application, for instance, and dotting that on, again, creating pattern and creating texture. Can I use slips and underglazes on the full round of my piece? Yes, you can. Underglazes are not glazes. They're more similar to slip than a glaze. They have a higher content of clay body in them, which makes them compatible to the clay body. And not necessarily higher amounts of glass formers. Okay, so consider how you want to finish your work, right? So slips and underglazes, you'll want to apply those predominantly while your work is pre-bisque, knowing that as my work gets closer to bone dry, as I apply larger amounts of wet slip, for instance, I'm going towards slaking down my body, which is not what I want. So that nice leather hard stage is a really perfect consistency to start applying your slips and underglazes. Okay, you can screen print those, brush those on, lots of different ways to sort of deal with that. Okay, another option we have are oxide washes, and I've mentioned this before. Typically you're going to do this after bisque. And you're basically going to sort of wash on an oxide wash, essentially oxides mixed with water. You want to start lighter, go darker. You will always be surprised how intense those colors can be. But those oxides will then reside in any recesses, okay? So then if I have a blank clay body with a lot of texture, I apply an oxide wash, for instance, then I wipe that off, then I glaze it. That's going to interact and it's going to really highlight the texture that I have. Okay, so that's something you may want to play with. That's going to interact with different glazes differently. So sort of you'll definitely want to do some tests and test tiles with that before you start. We didn't really get into test tiles either this semester, but essentially what you're doing is you're taking the clay body you're working with, you're making small samples. Typically I'll try and have those samples be similar to the texture and form that I'm making, so the results I get are going to be more beneficial to me. So if I'm doing a highly textured body of work but I use a clean flat surface for my test tiles, I'm not going to get the right information. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, with all of this said, how am I firing my work? Is this going to be high fire, low fire, cone 10, raku? These are things you want to plan for ahead of time. So before you even buy your clay, you'll want to have an idea of what you're making. If you don't know what you're making, okay, buy your clay, and then understand what clay you have, and then as you're making, understand what your options are in relation to that clay body. Okay, so if I'm working with a mid-range cone 5 clay, I'm very limited. So for instance, at Laney, we predominantly fired a cone 10. Okay, cone 5 will not really work. We do have electric kilns, but it's not going to be as quickly fired or glazed. Okay, so think about that. Oxidation reduction in a gas kiln will have a great effect on your work. So what those mean are the amount of oxygen present in the kiln. So when I reduce a kiln, I'm essentially increasing the gas within my mixture of my flame, which essentially is depriving the atmosphere inside the kiln of oxygen. Okay, so essentially it's a sooty, dirty flame that then sort of seeps into the clay body and the glazes, and you get a lot of reactions. Oftentimes it'll be darker. You might even get a darker clay body, for instance, during those processes. Oxidation is running a very clean kiln, okay? So if I put in white porcelain and I want white porcelain out, I'm going to run that in an oxidized environment. I do not want to run that in reduction, okay? Unless I'm looking for celadon, okay? So yeah, those are just some things to think about. I guess that's pretty much it. My phone's telling me it's gonna get hot and stop working here, so I think I'm gonna stop talking your ear off. I just wanted to make sure that we got a face-to-face. My videos haven't included my face. Hi everybody. Hope you're still out there listening, watching, staying safe. For anyone not in my class that's like, who's Laney? What's Laney? Go check it out. Laney College, Oakland, California, ceramics program, Laney Ceramics on Instagram. We're killing it. Students are great. Faculty are great. And I can't wait to see all of you again in the fall. And obviously let me know what's going on with you, what you need from me. And I'm going to update you all in terms of how we're going to get this work completed. So check out your email in the next week and we'll get you going. Thank you guys so much. I just can't say enough and how much appreciation I have for our ability to work together this semester. My first semester at Laney, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. So I hope everyone's staying safe, having fun, love seeing the in progress work, hope to see more, and catch you guys on the flip side. All right, thanks.